Welcome to this course on ethics, general ethics at Texas A&M. My name is James Berquist, and I'm the professor for this course. I am greatly looking forward to taking this journey with you. It's one of those philosophical journeys, the worth of which is truly evident to all. You can't but want to be a good person. I don't mean that you can't desire to be bad or according to some societal understanding, right? But you always want to find that way to act that really fulfills you in some way. I mean, nobody's going to deny that, and if they do, in words, deny such a thing, they're stating in words the way they think one ought to act, right? If somebody says, no, there's no such thing as good, all you should do is live your life in such a way that gives you the most immediate kind of satisfaction. They're making an ethical claim. They're saying this is the good, essentially. So our general ethics course is one, as I say, the relative worth which is truly evident to all, whether they see it explicitly or not. Now, in this lecture, I'm not only welcoming you to the course, but I'm getting us into some preliminary studies. So, ethics is our topic, and we're never going to stray far from it. However, we do have an opening section in logic, not to mention some practical details I'll go through in a second to help you think about getting through the course and what it's going to be like. But we live in a time where logic is underappreciated. I don't mean that people don't want to be logical or don't think about it at all. I hope many of you have actually had some experience with logic, but in my own experience, many students have very little familiarity with it going into some of these courses, and it's badly needed. Not because we can't be logical without studying logic, but because it can be really helpful to have explicitly in mind, how to make a good argument and how to learn. I mean, that's the whole point of this course, is to learn something about ethics, to make a good beginning in understanding what it is to be a good human being, what it is to do what one ought, or to what is the good for a human being, however you want to state it. If you don't know how it is you're going to come to some kind of certainty or a reasonable opinion, a reasonable belief, as people like to put it today, but I would like to say, just truth. If you think if you have no idea of what it means even to come to truth, how can you make a good beginning? So I can't promise you that we'll come to the end of this course and you'll be able to say to yourself, I know the truth, I know what is good and what is evil. But you'll make a good beginning, at rationally going through those questions, everything, detailed there. And one of the reasons you'll be able to do that is because you'll say to yourself, I have a sense of what it is to know something. And that's what these first 3 weeks are for. Which brings me to some of the practical details. I hope you've looked at your syllabus. I'll say that in a second here, but this particular lecture is it's the first one on logic, and we're doing Plato's Meno and Aristotle's Categories. Difficult texts. We'll try to do them as much justice as we can in a short amount of time to give us a sense of logic, or to begin our sense of logic. But we'll continue this in the next 2 weeks. So it'll be 3 weeks on logic, which is a fair amount of time in some sense, but in other ways, a simple, in other ways, almost nothing. So do your best with it. I'm going to try to really isolate those things that I think are most important for us to understand. And I'll talk about a number of different things, but I'll always try to keep in your focus what I most particularly want you to understand from logic, because we're not studying it as such, we're studying it as a means to being good ethicists, good ethical philosophers. Okay, so let's get into some very practical details here, and then get into Plato's Meno and Aristotle's categories. So first, make sure to check the syllabus. Note the different kinds of assignments you will run across. Everything on the quizzes, so there are going to be 3 basic kinds of assignments, right? Quizzes, some tests, and some response papers. Everything on the quizzes will either be in the reading or in the lecture explicitly noted. You will not have any surprises there unless you miss something key in the readings, and I'm not trying to get you to, those quizzes are not aimed at subtlety, they're aimed at the basic points. Those things which I think you should be able to get out of these authors, and which are most important, and thus you will get them in the lectures, so they're what I'll be talking about. The quizzes are aimed at helping you grasp what the great minds in question have said, held, believed, opined, etc. about ethics. There will be nothing controversial in these questions, by which I mean you're merely going to be asked what they said. You're not going to be asked to comment on it in any of the quizzes. That's where the response papers are going to come in. But for the quizzes, all I'm going to want you to really do is be able to repeat back. I mean, I'm going to ask true and false questions, multiple choice questions. No essay questions on the quizzes, all just tell me what is held by Aristotle, what's held by Epicurus, not Epictetus, we don't read him in this, unfortunately. Plato, Hume, Kant, Mill, what do they all hold on X, Y, or Z, on the nature of the good, etc. Those are the things I want you to be able to do to state objectively. The response papers are for where you can really do some philosophizing. So once you have that objective background, you know what somebody has said, you can comment on it or relate it to what somebody else has said. In the response papers, there will be some specific topics suggested, although I'll give you some wiggle room to do your own thing if you want to, but it's really your response to those readings, to what these different authors are saying. The lectures I intend to do both and give you a sense objectively what the authors are saying, and then do philosophy. We're going to engage, I love the word engage, by the way. We're going to engage the ideas of these people, incorporating them into a discussion. I say with past philosophers there, I meant to add past and future, depending on where we're talking about. If we're talking about Aristotle, we're bringing him in conversation with Hume and with Kant and with Mill, and vice versa, right? As well as with ourselves, and that's the real point of the lecture, is to be there both to see what people have said and to make a beginning on investigating what we think is right, what we think is true. There's no point to doing philosophy if you can't either come to an answer about a question. What is truth? What is justice? What is goodness? What does it mean to be moral, etc., all those things. If you can't make any real progress on that, there's no point in asking the question. There's certainly no point taking a course on it. So our goal is to really, engage closely with the different theories, ideas which have been brought forward, and to come up with something, make a real beginning in actually answering the questions. Now, the midterm and the final are going to be like extended quizzes. I'll have to see how the spirit moves, as they say, when it comes to those, the midterm and the final, about whether or not I put on any essay questions. If I do, there will only be one on each or on one of them. But I'm not. I have to see how the first response paper goes and how things are running, and whether or not I think I need to hear more philosophizing. Okay, but it won't be a long essay question. It'd be like, write a paragraph to 3 paragraphs or something, but nothing, not asking you to write a paper or something for a midterm. Midterm would be mostly just being able to give, a kind of overview of, as I was saying before, the objective statements of the authors, and the final likewise, but for the whole course. focusing mostly in the second half when it gets to the final, but tossing in some of the key ideas from the first half. And to me, this is just something that has to be done. When I was in undergrad, it was quizzes like this that, as I would like to put it now, kept me honest. They kept me from sort of half-heartedly reading the text and then simply, quote-unquote, spouting philosophical about these ideas, but actually trying to first grasp what the author was saying. You can't really get anywhere if you don't make that effort. The reason for it is that we are creatures of community. I mean, the whole institution of learning is based upon the fact that we pass down knowledge. We build. Sometimes we repudiate, but we always reference. So what you'll see is that there is a real discussion going on over the centuries. Sometimes authors are agreeing and building off of each other. Sometimes they are repudiating and trying to go in another direction, but it's always in reference to each other. That's the way human beings operate. We learn from one another, we build from one another, and we might push against one another. So we have to do that too. If we're going to be any good. And that means knowing what people have said. There's something historical in every, especially survey philosophy course. And we're not going to forget that. I mean, this is a general ethics course. We're not simply going into Aristotle or Kant or Hume or somebody. Although we'll spend more time with Aristotle, as a matter of fact. But we really do have to get a sense of what has been said over the ages. What are the critical theories that have been most formative, etc. And it's important to know what they are saying and, be able to think in those terms so that you can engage with it. I love that word, engage. Okay, so now, as I was saying, we want to start with logic, and as I get into the problem in the Meno in the first page of the handout number 1, I want to reiterate what I was saying about getting into logic first. I've been in too many situations, I've taught classes where I realized one of the big problems was, although people can still think and make arguments and be logical, not having really done any logic formally was incredibly detrimental to their ability to come to any kind of certainty. And this is what it is. Again, I was talking in the last slide about what it is to be human, but let me specify that a little bit. What it is to be rational doesn't just mean to form a community, but to be able to reflect upon oneself. That's a key distinction, right? When you look for something human or rational rather than just intelligent in that generic sense, like there are plenty of animals that are intelligent, but what is it that distinguishes a human being is that they're self-reflective. They don't just experience and react and make choices based upon the notions of pleasure and pain. We can actually think about ourselves and ourselves in the moment and ourselves in the future. We can think about goals beyond the moment and order ourselves to that, and thus, you can form, well, I'll just put it this way. That self-reflection, that ability to reflect upon our own status, is really part of what distinguishes us from animal life. We have the ability to really step outside of our own self. And that's what you do when you study logic, because to study logic is to study the acts of reason, to study the mind itself and how it moves and how it comes to be able to move. And if you can't do that, if you do that explicitly, you're really helping yourself be set up to not just to make arguments, but to understand such that you can make arguments, to really understand a different reality. By a different reality, all I mean is to be able to understand reality itself, not just the mind. So my big point is, we want to do ethics. We want to be able to think clearly. If we're going to do that, I think there are some logical principles that we need to get clear in our own minds, and that's what's going on here. So it starts off with a Meno. I have a selection from that reading for you to investigate, to go through. It's not an easy reading in every respect, but I hope you have some fun with it. Some people have an easier time reading Plato than others. The translation's a little bit archaic. I apologize for that. That's what happens trying to do, open source stuff, the stuff that you don't need to find permissions for, get permissions for, to use. But even with the somewhat archaic style, I hope these questions are pretty clear. Socrates, summing up what Meno has said to him, puts it thusly: I understand the point you would make, Meno. Do you see what a captious argument you are introducing? That forsooth, I love the word forsooth as well, but I understand it's not one we use typically. A man cannot inquire either about what he knows or what he does not know. Should not be wit. What he does not know, for he cannot inquire about what he knows because he knows it, and in that case is in no need of inquiry. Nor again can he inquire about what he does not know, since he does not know what he is to inquire into. And I paraphrase this below, saying, how can one inquire into what one does not know? For if one does not know it, how can one look at it so as to inquire into it? If one knows it, on the other hand, then there's no need to inquire. Now, the first times I was coming across this as a student, I kind of thought it was a silly argument. And you'll find that whenever you think you've caught Plato in a silly argument, you're almost certainly in the wrong, or you're missing the point. But here, in this case, I'll say I was definitely wrong. There's a profound concern here, one that's not easy to state without some examples. Let me give you an example. Let's say you are talking with a friend and they say this strange word to you, quantum mechanics. And as the conversation goes on, you realize, I don't know what they're talking about. I need to have this term clarified. You say, what is quantum mechanics? And they then say, oh, you've never heard that? You don't know what that is? Oh, you need to look that up. I don't have time to explain it right now for whatever reason. So you go and look it up, and you see some of the key concepts, and you look into more and more and more. You investigate, and you learn more and more and more. Okay. That's all well and good, but you would never have looked into it without your friend saying quantum mechanics. And thus, although you didn't know what it was, you at least had something to look into, something you could go and Google, something you could go and look up in your philosophy books, or your physics books in this case, right? Socrates is concerned about that. He's not concerned about the question of whether or not we investigate things that we don't know. I mean, we obviously do that to some extent, but the point is, they're always something we can look at. That's why I put it the way I did, right? Maybe even it's just a name we can use to look something up. But if that's the only way we come to learn something, there is a real problem. And I wonder if you see it. But if everything that you learn depends upon having something to look into, doesn't it becomes necessary that you could never learn anything that is not already known by a human being? Everything you would come to learn would be haphazard. There'd be no real discovery. There could be no order to investigation such that you could learn new things that were not already contained in the haphazard occurrences of your experience and your discussions with others. So Socrates' concern here, Plato's concern is, when I try to learn something, is that based upon haphazard information that comes my way? Or do I learn because I can actually make inquiries, I can investigate reality and come up with things that I was never looking for precisely, right? But which I came to see by my investigation, simply speaking. If I don't say that, then there's no such thing as a real science or a body of knowledge that's investigated. It's just, whatever you haphazardly bump into. And so that's the concern. Socrates' way of dealing with this is funny. If you're trying to say, well, how do I investigate something that I truly don't know anything about? He says, well, maybe it is actually the case that you do know everything. This might sound crazy, but you have to bear with him in this pages 1 and 2 of the handout, number 1 that I sent you. What if the soul is immortal and has been born many times and has beheld all things, so that it is no wonder that she, the soul, should be able to recollect all that she knew before about virtue and other things? So this explanation boils down to saying all learning is essentially remembering something. Socrates is alleging we know all things, but we simply need to come to remember them. Okay. To be clear, Aristotle, the other person, will really be investigating in this logical treatise, if you will explicitly reject this explanation and give us something more common sense to replace it with. But here, before I don't want you to just dismiss it simply out of hand. That's not a way to proceed. But I want us to really think about this. Before dismissing it out of hand as being like, that's crazy. Who thinks that it's all recollection? The soul's simply been around for all time and we're just getting reincarnated, which is we're born into the world many times, etc. Even if that's probably in the end incorrect, or at least not something you could argue to, what is he trying to deal with? He's trying to deal with the fact that how do you come to how can you ever come to know something that isn't told to you, at least in some way? And it would be, well, what if you actually know all things? And all it is recollection. Well, that would deal with that concern. You, in investigating an area, would be investigating something you already know, to be sure, but not simply speaking, but rather in a secondary sense, just like a person who remembers something, who knows things but has to work to recollect them. That's one way to answer this dilemma. And even if you didn't take it to the extreme that Socrates does, you might say, well, maybe what I needed to say is, well, there are things that I know, simply speaking, and can recall at any time. And then maybe there's a way of knowing things that is radically incomplete and based upon other knowledge. Maybe there's a way to proceed that is not so much a bumping into a new thing to know, as it is an unfolding of what I know, so that I know it in some sense and yet in another sense I don't. Okay, that's more Aristotelian, by the way, and probably more common sense. However, before we get there, we can at least see this solution to the problem already does deal with some of the philosophical quandaries you might find yourself in when you realize, is there anything, any alternative to saying either I know everything, how can I investigate something I don't know? Now, if that's still confusing to you, and it would be fine if it is, it's confusing to me now too. More confusing to him probably than to you. So Socrates decides to help him by proof. There's an example. I apologize for some of the letters in this figure not being as visible as they should be. There was a miscommunication there somewhere between myself and the computer about how to detail that. But Socrates says, look, here, so you have this slave boy who's been raised in your household. You know what he knows and doesn't know. And you say he doesn't know. Oh, excuse me. He doesn't know how to. I'll show you that even those areas where he doesn't know something, as it turns out in geometry, there's lots he doesn't know. Socrates is going to show that he really does know these things, but he has to recollect them. And here's the problem, by the way. I want you to see, understand this example of Mino's square, as it's called. You're given an original line AB, and you have the square ABCD on that line, right? Now the goal is to find the line upon which the square of that line is equal to double the area of the square on our original line. So we're trying to find a line, the square upon which is double in area to the square on line AB. Now, the slave boy gets quickly thinks, well, that's easy. So here you've got this line AB, it's 2 feet. The square on line AB will be 4 feet. And then you take, you want to find 8 feet. Why don't you just double line AB? But if you do that, you've got a line of 4 feet, you square it to 16 feet, and all of a sudden, you're not talking about twice the area, but 4 times the area. Well, that's too large. What do you do then? Well, the slave boy wants to take a line of 3 feet, but that's 9 feet squared, right, etc. And so at this point, the slave boy first is confident that he knows what to do, and then he realizes he doesn't. It's an important moment in any Socratic dialogue. It's the apophatic moment. The interlocutor realizes he doesn't know something. Socrates comments on it in the text. He says he's in a better state now, right? Before he didn't know this, the answer to the question, but he thought he did. Now he knows he doesn't know. So he's at least has that advantage. Now he can actually investigate in earnest. And this is a comment to really help Meno, but it's a comment we should take to heart, right? We're trying to learn here, and it's not that we should try to forget everything that we know before, especially not common sense principles. But we should be ready to truly engage and to really think about this whole question of like, what is good, how ought we to act in a genuine manner. Don't forget that a key point here to really engaging with somebody is actually entertaining their ideas. So Socrates' way of getting the slave boy and Meno to attend to him is to show them what they don't know. Hopefully for us we don't have to go to something like that extreme, but do engage with these people, so that the people we read, so that you can do something similar, right? You can say, okay, I want to come to really know something, and I'm going to really listen to these various people. All right. So, how do you come up in this Meno example? How do you come up with that line? Well, after he's shown the slave boy that he doesn't know what he's talking about, Socrates has him draw the other figure that you see here. He has him complete the whole square, not just AIGE, but also the interior square that's DBHF. Now, that square, as it turns out is a square, it doesn't really go into proving that, but it can be proved very easily, is comprised of the 4 diagonals, as Socrates calls them. Now, what the diagonal in a square does is cut the square into 2 equal triangles. Now, you can prove that easily, side, side, as I indicate there in the notes, right? Oh, excuse me again. Late night. Side gives us equal triangles, because we know AB is equal to AD. It's a square, right? And it's equal to BC and to CD. And they all share the common side DB, therefore the 2 triangles DCB and ABD are equal triangles in area. Now, you take that same line of reasoning with all of the triangles that are set up by the different diagonals, and you see that that interior square, DFHB or BHFD, however you want to name it, has 4 of those triangles, which are all equal to each other. Whereas our original square, ABCD, only has 2. Well, 4 is twice 2, and thus the area of DBHF is twice the area of ABCD. And thus our line, DB, is that line upon which, the square upon which is equal in area to twice the square upon our original line. And we've done our proof. Now, that was me just going through the mathematical proof. But the point that Socrates is trying to make is at the same time easier and more confusing to follow. The way he explains this to the slave boy is by not explaining it at all, but rather by asking questions. Now, they're very leading questions, there's no doubt about that. Socrates makes it clear he is ordering the questions for the slave boy, but he never answers a question. He always asks questions. And the slave boy is not merely answering. This is important to realize when you're reading the dialogue. He's not merely answering with, well, I think this is what you want me to say, so I'll say this. He's really giving his genuine answers, and he's led to understand. So Socrates says, look, I didn't tell him anything. All I did was ask him questions. He answered them all, and his knowledge was there. I mean, he's the one who came up with that square, that line, as being what it is. And as I'm looking at this, I see there's a missing reference there at the end. It's the last line of the Meno dialogues, wherever that is in the handout, you can find it. But before we get there, the whole explanation that's been given by Socrates, right, he's saying it's got to be recollection, because all I've done is ask questions. The answers came to the slave boy entirely. Came from him, excuse me. The thoughts are all his own. Thus must not knowledge be in fact recollection. Now, if you're going to disagree with Plato, you're going to have to come up with a reason. I think you can, but at the same time, realize there's a force here. A force to his argument. There was no giving of the answer to the slave boy. So if it's not recollection, you have to explain how he was able to come up with those answers that he clearly didn't know, or didn't have in mind ready to hand. However, it's also important to know that Socrates makes our first ethical point of the course here, that he doesn't hold particularly strongly to the point, the necessity of to the truth of recollection as a theory, but he does hold to the necessity of refuting the concern that's at the heart of Meno's point, namely, that all learning is really just a kind of haphazard activity that you come across by chance, and there's no real new learning. Rather, he says you have to hold that you'll have to realize you'll be a better, braver, less helpless person if you realize that you can truly come to know things that you're not dependent simply upon happenstance and chance to quote unquote learning anything new. He actually thinks you have to hold that learning is really possible, or you'll be a less good person. And so our first ethical point is made. If you deny Socrates' point, if you deny that aspect of it, that learning is really possible as a real activity, you can be forced into the position that any human attempt to come to know something is nothing more than chance. And that there's no real learning, no real investigation, no real deepening of human knowledge. All it is whatever a human being, whatever is passed on from one person. It's kind of a necessity, just like the arguments for against free will. It'd be like arguments against the possibility of really coming to know anything other than what is passed down or you bump into by happenstance. It's all chance. There's no real investigation. There's no orderly procedure. And he says if you hold that, you're not going to be as good a person. And I think that's an important intuition right there. If you think you can't come to know the good, but all that would happen is you have to be able to kind of bump into it on a happenstance, you're not going to look for the good. Or better yet, right? What if you say, okay, I want to look for the good, but that can mean all sorts of things. It's an ambiguous term, and boy, is it ever an ambiguous term. And you have no principle whereby to look one way or the other. If you really just say, well, I'll need to wait until something strikes me, and I run into some kind of person who says something, or I happen across some passage in a book somewhere. If you hold that way, you're not going to be better, braver, and less helpless. You're going to be more cowardly, certainly more helpless, certainly worse. Now that more cowardly might seem strange, but you're not going to be somebody out there striving to make yourself better, right? That's what Socrates is saying, and I do think it's an important point. It's our first ethical claim of the semester, and I think it's a strong one. But regardless of that for the moment, we can also still say, we've got to ask ourselves, how do we come to know anything, right? Socrates gave us one view. Whether he holds to it or not, all the way is another question, but it certainly is a start in our investigation. How do we come to know something that we didn't know before? So I give these 3 or 4 points, I should say. And I do think, although we've talked over some of them already, right, like that question, it's that third point that is really important, right? Even if you're not sure what you think about the theory of recollection, even if you're not sure about how learning should be described, what should be sure and certain is that we can know things, right? There's no question, for instance, that the square on the diagonal is double in area to the square on the original line. There's no question about that. That's certain, that's sure, that's definite. We can know that. And that's another thing that's helpful about that example and about geometry in general, which is why I gave that 4th point on the slide there. Geometry provides us with amazing opportunities to see what must be said and how to know things, right? And that should give us not just hope in other areas, but the realization that the mind really can see certainty. So those are the things to take out of the Meno. Now, getting into the categories, this is tough stuff. I'm not going to pretend that it's any easier than it seems. What I will say is that it's simpler. Simpler and easier are not the same things. What I mean is it's less complex. Aristotle is actually trying to get back to the very beginnings of human reasoning. And so if you think about it, like, what's the first thing you're going to do as a reasoning being, as a being that can that is rational? And the answer is, before argument, you're going to have to be able to make propositions. And before you make propositions, like statements like, all cats are white, or, something like that, whether it's true or false, you're going to have concepts. So the first thing you have to talk about is coming up with a concept, and that's what Aristotle is doing in the categories. To categorize is to accuse, etymologically speaking. It's to name something according to what it does or is. The person who categorizes kind of accuses things in certain ways, names them. Well, and if that etymology isn't helping, you really think in terms of naming. So to categorize is also sometimes called to predicate, both important words. When you predicate something, you are naming it according to what it is. And that's the most important thing to say here as a preliminary. So I say this is our first work, pretty much the first work of formal logic. The Meno had a section on part of logic, reasoning, but now we get into logic, properly speaking. I was there trying to set up a preamble to some stuff I'm going to say later about different acts of reason, different acts of reasoning. But for now, I just want you to really reflect upon the notion of forming a concept, what it means to form a concept. Because it does have something to do with looking at the reality and delineating it, right? Putting it into speech. Categorizing it. That's what you do. So Aristotle wants to talk about categorizing reality, how the mind does that. And so here's the opening lines. Things are said to be named equivocally when, though they have common names, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each. Thus, a man and a figure in a picture, not necessarily a human being or even an animal, can both lay claim to the name animal, yet these are equivocally named. For Though they have the common name, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each. Excuse me again. 4. Should anyone define in what sense each is an animal, the definition would be appropriate to that case only. Okay, what does he mean? So the Greek word there is zoon, which means either living being, living bodily being, or it means picture, and not necessarily of an animal, not necessarily of a living bodily thing. So it's kind of like saying bat, right? If I say bat, you either have the image of a flying mammal, furry flying mammal that's a little bit scary to some, or you have the image of a wooden stick that's shaped in a specific way, right, that you use to play baseball with. Those are totally different things, even though the name that we give them corresponds insofar as it sounds the same, right? But it's a totally different thing. And that's what he means when he says you categorize or name things. And think in terms of name here, as the text puts it. You name things equivocally when you give them the same name, but the definition you would give for each is radically different. Now you name things univocally when the name you give corresponds identically to the thing in question. So the example he gives you here, a man is profound. A man and an ox are both animals. By animal, he means living bodily being. A human being is a living bodily being. We're not animals, simply speaking. We're rational animals, to Aristotle. But that means we're still animals. We're living bodily beings with reason, right? So a man and an ox are both living bodily beings. And so when you say living bodily being or animal about a man, or when you say it about an ox, you're saying the word in the same way. You're using it in the same way. Even if there's differences between a man and an ox, insofar as you say they're living and bodily, you mean the same thing. So that's a speech that's univocal, speaking in one voice. Saying animal about either one is to use the name animal in the same way. Now, derivative, things are said to be spoken derivatively when they derive their name from some other name, but differ from it in termination. That sounds trickier than it is. Right? If I say, I give you this example here, I think it's a good example. Protein is healthy, the body can be healthy. My complexion can be healthy, right? I'm using the same word, but I'm using it differently. But I'm still but it's not so different that it's equivocal, right? It's not like the bat versus the bat, the baseball bat versus the furry mammal. It's not like the picture on the wall that's not of an animal versus an animal, right? Healthy protein bar, healthy complexion, healthy diet, healthy body are all the same thing. They're related words, but what it is to be a healthy diet and what it is to be a healthy body are not the same thing. So it's neither equivocal nor is it univocal, and that's why he says derivative, right? When I say healthy protein shake, right? I'm speaking about something that produces health. When I speak about a healthy complexion, I'm speaking about a sign of good health. When I say a healthy body, I'm speaking about health most properly, really. I'm saying the body has health. And so health is being spoken there more directly. The other ones are a falling away. That's what derivative means, a falling away. It's like they're related, but they're not the same thing. And this is important because if you've ever had conversations where you think to yourself, ugh, I'm pretty sure I'm right, but I can't quite pin down whether my opponent's been wrong. Often it will come down to something like this, derivative naming. I remember having a discussion. This will be important for us later in the year. Like, how do you talk responsibly about... I'm from California originally, and we just, in California, legalized marijuana, right? How do you consider rationally whether smoking marijuana is an ethical thing to do? I remember having a conversation where I was talking about, well, let's think about the effects, and the person I was talking to was saying, well, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, everything we take affects us. But the point I was trying to make was, right, that when you talk about an effect, you can talk about it in different effects that have that are different in themselves. And the key is to see, I mean, yeah, saying this affects me, this changes me, and so, I mean, that could be said in many different ways. And they're not all the same. Even if you're not speaking equivocally, you're still speaking derivatively. Different kinds of change, falling away from the very notion of change. Because change isn't necessarily bad, but some kinds of changes could be. So leaving aside the question of whether or not marijuana, I mean, at this point we're leaving aside whether or not it's something legitimate that you could use. The point is, we need to be able to make those distinctions if we're going to make a really rational inquiry, be able to distinguish between univocal, derivative, and equivocal. And that's why I spend so much time on this. But I'll also say, right, what's really important here to note most of all is that beginning notion of things said, some are said this way. It's of things insofar as they are said, and that you speak insofar as you have a concept. The concept precedes the spoken word, and it actually outlasts it, because you speak to somebody and your voice conveys the notion to your hearer, but then the voice dies away, right? Our voices don't last forever. That's fine. When I say it right now, I mean, I'm saying many words, and those words are denoting concepts to you in various configurations, but my voice, I mean, for each word is passing away, right? That's something else that Aristotle's really getting clear here, is that of things said, right? It's about the naming of things, the categorizing of them, and that's a work of the mind. That's a work of the mind. And I got distracted there for a moment. It's a work of the mind. It's the first work of the mind, and it's presupposed to other ones. What we want to... Let me say that over again. What we want to know here, right, is that it's all going to start with this coming up with concepts. How do we come up with our concepts in the first place? Aristotle is saying, well, let's start by distinguishing different ways of naming, and then we'll move on from there. And that's what we're doing. His examples, by the way, are important, right? When I say somebody is courageous, I'm saying courage about them. The word courageous has reference to the notion of courage, first and foremost, and it's applying that to a person, the courageous man. And similar, like a grammarian, we're talking about them as being somebody who is fluent in grammar and knows how to teach it, right? Or a scientist, we're naming them from science. Those are derivative namings, categorizing, calling, etc. Okay. Now, what you see next is very simple interweaving. Without interweaving, it's important to realize, right, after you say, okay, let's talk about speaking univocally or equivocally, let's make sure we distinguish something here, right? I can speak in simple or complex sentences. I can say, man runs. Or I can say, the man runs, right? I can say, man, ox, runs, wins. I can say those all separately, but if I start to weave them together, I'm doing something else. And he says, right now, just think about that first thing. Man runs. Excuse me, man, or ox, or runs, or wins. All of those are simple, right? There's no composition there. There's no interweaving, and that's the literal translation there. So as I say in my subtext there, he's setting a difference between speaking a proposition / statement / interrogation / command and the parts thereof. Penguin swims puts a subject and a verb together and conveys something more than either of them alone. In this work, we are interested, though, in the things alone, not in them spoken with interweaving. So we'll get to that other part more later. But first, let's just remember, we're trying to speak about the very naming of things, kind of most primarily, coming up with simple concepts. And this is where what he starts to do is most helpful for us. He distinguishes between categorizing things as being subjects, or what I'm going to say are accidents, that is, present in a subject or a substance, as it's going to turn out to be. So if I say something about something else, I can do that in two ways. I can say George is a human being, or I can say George has brown hair, right? Now again, this is getting a little bit away from the notion of simple concepts, but it's to make a point here. Brown hair is something that would inhere in George. It's not something that would exist in him, right? It doesn't exist by itself. You don't see brown hair by itself, or you might see it ripped out, right? But maybe a better example, but you don't see brown by itself. It's always brown. It's always in things, right? So you can always distinguish reality. I mean, logically, right? We look at things and we look at that which tells us something about the thing. So all the qualities that a thing has, its color, its shape, its relationships to the things around it. We're going to get into a whole list of categories. But we always, I mean, when we look at reality, we make those distinctions between what a thing is and that which exists in it, that which inheres in it, that which is a part, in a sense, not like a quantitative part necessarily, although I suppose it could be, but that which is that doesn't exist except apart from the thing. And so that first, there's a major division being made here between categorizing things as like what a thing is and categorizing them as accidents. Okay, what does that mean? This distinction between when you look at reality, you see things that have qualities and quantities and relations and all these other things, but you're seeing things that have all that. That's what Aristotle wants you to see. The first most basic logical distinction the mind makes about reality is between substances and the things that inhere in substances. And by substance you mean that which has other things existing in it, but you don't say it exists in something else. And that's what's being said here. But what I add on in this slide is the realization that you might have things that are neither in a subject or set of a subject at all. That's really the more important point here, right? So if I say Joe, the person I'm talking about, is not said of anything, nor is he in anything. What does that mean? He doesn't exist in something else, right? You don't say Joe, he's not like the color brown. He doesn't need a thing to exist in, right? But Joe is also not something that you would give an answer to the question, what is it? You don't, when somebody says to Joe, what are you? He doesn't say Joe. That's who he is. He would say, I'm a human being. I'm a rational animal. I'm a man. Those would answer the question, what are you, right? So that would be the question of substance, like what is this thing in front of me? When I say how is this thing, then you start to look at Joe and see all of everything that inheres in him, right? His height, his weight, his build, his hair color, his personality, all these things that are part of who he is, but not don't tell us what he is. They tell us how he is. And that's really the more important distinction here, as I was saying again in the last slide, right? We can go through everything Aristotle says about there's a class of things which are neither present in a subject nor predicable of a subject. They're not said of a subject, such as the individual horse. It's to help us see, right? When I start to categorize reality, I see some things as substances or things that exist in themselves. I see other things as accidents, as inhering in the subject. So I don't see yellow as being a thing. I see it as being something that, a thing on its own. It's always a thing in something else. That's true about all sorts of things, but there's all sorts of things that in particular I see, and I wouldn't say they are inhering in something else, and I would, even though I'd say they're substances, I wouldn't say they're predicated of a substance. They don't tell me what a substance is, rather they are the substance in question. So any particular individual existing thing has things existing in it, have accidents, so-called, and that's the term I'm using for things that exist in something else, have accidents inhering in them. But I also wouldn't say they answer the question, what is it? I don't say this cat. I don't say what is it? I say it's this cat. I say no, it's cat. That's what it is to be, what's a good cat name? Rascal. It's not Rascal. That's not what it is. That's what it is a cat, and Rascal is a cat, and he exists here and now in this various ways. Okay. So, to keep this, again, rooted in first principles, what's going on here? Aristotle is saying, let's start our logical inquiry about by distinguishing different ways of categorizing. I can speak about what a thing is, I can speak about how a thing is. And that how could be divided in all sorts of ways, and that's what he gets into here, right? I could speak about what a thing is, that's substance, or I could speak about how much it is, or how it is simply. I could speak about its relation, its place, its time, its position, its state, its action or passion, action or affection. And he gives examples of all those things right there, and they're all important in their own way. But the key for us, right, is just, well, look. I see that when I start to categorize and name reality, I do it according to different modes of existing. Either as existing in itself or existing in something else, right? Cat doesn't exist in anything. Excuse me, this cat doesn't exist in anything, but I would say all sorts of accidents exist in this cat, right? So I need to be able to distinguish that, and then to distinguish the different sorts of things that exist in the substances around you, right? And that's where this gets us. It's important to note, as Aristotle states on page 12, right? None of the things we've said so far really even gets to the question of truth or falsity. It's a setup to actually investigating truth and falsity, right? Because when I say man, white, runs, wins, I'm not making a statement. I'm not saying man is white or saying mankind like donuts. I'm not making a claim when I just say man or when I just say donuts. So there's not truth or falsity there. There's not correct or in error. There's nothing correct nor nothing in error. It's just a statement of concept. And that's really insightful on Aristotle's part, right? To say, before you can start to ask the question, is this right or wrong, you have to have a notion of this. You have to have, is this statement right or wrong? You have to have the concepts that go into building that, and they can't be either right or wrong, or you'd have an infinite regress. He really says you need to start with that. How do I come to, how do I start off this whole journey? Well, it's to look at how I abstract from, or categorize, I should say, reality around me, how I come up with concepts and delineate them from each other. So, what to take from the categories? Logic at least concerns things and speaking / naming / categorizing. We say we apprehend things, right? When I look around, I can apprehend this desk, this chair, this computer, this coffee maker, all these things, right? I apprehend them, and even before I have a name for it, right, I imagine I still have the concept being formed. But especially after you have the name, you start to really delineate the different concepts according to those names that you have learned for them. But that's before I've ever even tried to make any claims about them. So when I say, so what Aristotle is doing here is talking about, like I said, a primary active reason, that which is presupposed everything else, coming up with concepts about which you can speak. And that gives us our first sense of what logic really is. So secondly, what to take out of the categories, right? We also get a sense of the next part, right? If you're talking about coming up with concepts, the next thing that's going to be important to talk about is placing those together or dividing them, like saying man is a animal, but a rational animal. You're both there saying something that's common to him and other animals, namely living bodily being, right? That's what an animal is, but also different. That rationality, it differentiates him. So the next part of logic is presumably going to be relating concepts in one way or another, either uniting them in some way or dividing them from each other. For the purposes of our course going forward, I want to emphasize univocal versus equivocal versus derivative. One of the reasons I went into more detail there is because just that simple distinction is huge, right? Know when you are speaking derivatively. Don't let yourself be confused about that. So when we get to notions of goodness, we're going to have to really say, okay, this word may not be equivocal, but it's definitely derivative. There's definitely a primary meaning here, and we want to come up with that, but we can say the word good in all sorts of ways. The question is going to be, what's the primary way? And how does it relate to ethics? And is there a meaning that's beyond ethics? That would be question 2, right? But what's the primary meaning and how does it relate to ethics? Because you don't want to presume, you don't want to assume that you know what you mean when you use the word good when you're doing ethics, because it can be used in all sorts of ways. A good carpenter is not necessarily a good man. A good bank robber is not a insane statement. Somebody can be good at bank robbing, but we wouldn't say that's an ethical term of goodness, right? We have to make sure we know what we mean when we use that word. So that beginning there is really important. And finally, although I'm not gonna go to this as much, right? We do get a list of categories that's interesting. If we were studying a course on logic, this would be a major question. Are there more categories for us right now? The more important thing is substance versus accident, right? So I've been talking about substances are the things, and when I talk about what they are, I'm still speaking according to their substance, like what a thing is. I'm talking about the being that's existing in itself. So, the cat, this human being, this tree. Those are all substances, right? But they all have qualities and quantities and relations and all these other things inherent in them and relating them to others. That shows you again, that the difference between the subject and what is in the subject is the most important thing, substances and accidents. And then speaking substantially is to really retain a sense of speaking about what the thing is in itself. And that's why, well, a number of things there, but I'll leave it at that. Right? When you speak according to the substance, you're saying what a thing is. That becomes important for us because we want to end up talking about, what are the goods of a human being speaking substantially? That is to say, what are the goods of a human being as such, not of a human being accidentally speaking, right? There might be things that are good for parts of oneself or the accidents that inhere in oneself, but that aren't good for you simply speaking. So, for instance, it might be good for a human being to be handsome or to be beautiful, right? But that's accidental. Unless you mean those words in a more profound way, right? And they could even lead you into doing bad things, to want to be beautiful or to want to be handsome, to want to be, good in that very accidental way. I don't mean you shouldn't care about such things. The accidents are still part of your being, but it's important to make sure that when you're talking about what it is to be ethical, you put the right order on things. You look to the very substance of man first. So that's what I want to get out of that. And it's only beginning. We'll look into all these things more. Thanks for bearing with me. A long 1-hour lecture. The logic lectures are all going to be a little bit longer because I'm trying to pack a lot in there. Even if I try to boil it down to I really want you to know this, this, and this, right? They're still going to be longer. But once we get into the ethics portion, I try to dial it down to keep it between 30 and 45 minutes if possible. So look forward to that. And I look forward to working with you all. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. That I'm always there. I will always respond within 24 hours unless it's a weekend or holidays. And yeah, don't hesitate, especially if you have practical questions here at the beginning. It's good to get them answered quickly. I think everything's laid out on this on our eCollege pretty well, but I make mistakes and things get left out or not clear. If you have a question, don't be shy about it. And have a wonderful week.